What begins as a routine conversation slowly turns tense, as one unexpected exchange shifts the entire mood. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not because of raised voices or dramatic outbursts, but because two strong personalities simply refuse to move past a point of disagreement. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment begins the way many daytime talk show conversations do, with the panel seated comfortably behind the table, the studio lights steady, the audience already warmed up from earlier segments. Mark Wahlberg is introduced as the guest of the day, joining the hosts to talk about a mix of current projects, personal discipline, and the values he often speaks about publicly. From the opening moments, the tone is relaxed and familiar. Wahlberg appears composed, leaning slightly forward as he listens, nodding as the hosts welcome him. Behar, seated near the center of the table, offers a light comment about his schedule and work ethic, drawing a small laugh from the audience. At first, the conversation stays safely within expected territory. Wahlberg talks about balancing family life with work, the importance of routine, and how discipline has shaped his career. The hosts respond with affirmations and follow-up questions. Behar interjects with a remark that gently challenges the idea that discipline alone leads to success, pointing out that opportunity, timing, and social factors also play a role. Her tone is casual, almost conversational, and at this stage, there's no sense of conflict. Wahlberg smiles politely and acknowledges the point, saying that everyone's path is different, but that personal responsibility still matters to him. As the discussion continues, the conversation gradually shifts toward broader cultural topics. One of the co-hosts references comments Wahlberg has made in past interviews about hard work and accountability, connecting them to ongoing national debates about success and privilege. The audience remains quiet but attentive, reacting with soft murmurs rather than applause. Behar leans back slightly in her chair, hands resting on the table, and frames a question that subtly reframes Wahlberg's message. She suggests that emphasizing personal responsibility can sometimes overlook systemic challenges people face. Wahlberg listens carefully, his posture straightening as he prepares to respond. He doesn't interrupt, allowing her to finish fully, which keeps the exchange calm and respectful. When he speaks, his voice remains even. He explains that his perspective comes from his own experiences, and that acknowledging systemic issues doesn't mean individuals shouldn't still strive to do their best. At this point, the exchange feels like a thoughtful debate rather than a disagreement. Behar follows up quickly, and this is where the tone begins to shift, though only slightly. She points out that messages from celebrities can carry weight, and that framing success as purely a result of discipline might unintentionally dismiss real barriers others face. Her tone sharpens just enough to be noticeable, and she gestures lightly with one hand for emphasis. The audience reacts with a brief ripple of applause, signaling agreement with her point. Wahlberg pauses before answering, a moment that feels longer on live television than it likely is. He nods, then responds by clarifying that he's not dismissing anyone's struggles, but he challenges the idea that talking about discipline is harmful. He says that for him, it's about offering encouragement, not judgment. His body language remains controlled, but he leans in a bit more, signaling engagement rather than retreat. The moderator attempts to balance the exchange, briefly summarizing both viewpoints and inviting the conversation to continue. However, Behar circles back, this time more directly questioning whether Wahlberg's messaging fully accounts for social inequality. Her voice remains calm, but the repetition signals that she's not satisfied with the earlier answer. The studio audience grows quieter, sensing the shift from casual discussion to something more pointed. Wahlberg responds by gently but firmly challenging the framing of her question. He says that while inequality is real, he believes conversations should also focus on empowering people rather than discouraging them. He emphasizes that his comments are often taken out of context and that his intention is to motivate, not to criticize. His tone remains respectful, but there's now a clear firmness in his delivery that wasn't there at the start. Behar reacts by tilting her head slightly and offering a measured rebuttal, noting that intention and impact can be different. She stresses that public figures need to be aware of how their words are received. The exchange remains civil, but the rhythm of the conversation has changed. The hosts are no longer simply taking turns. They are responding more quickly, occasionally overlapping at the edges of sentences. One of the co-hosts interjects to ease the tension, adding that these conversations are important precisely because they reveal different perspectives. The attempt softens the moment briefly, drawing a small laugh from the audience. Wahlberg smiles in response, but his attention returns quickly to Joy Behar, signaling that the discussion is not finished. As the segment nears its midpoint, the disagreement becomes more clearly defined. Wahlberg challenges the idea that emphasizing personal effort undermines awareness of systemic problems. He says both conversations can exist at the same time. Joy Behar counters that in practice, they often don't, and that media narratives tend to favor individual success stories over structural change. The audience reacts again, this time with mixed responses, a few claps, some murmurs. The hosts exchange quick glances, aware that the conversation is now walking a fine line typical of live daytime television. No one raises their voice, but the tension is evident in the pacing, the pauses, and the careful choice of words. The moderator signals that they'll continue the discussion after a short break, giving the segment a natural pause point. As the camera prepares to cut, Wahlberg nods and smiles politely, while Joy Behar adjusts her papers and looks toward the moderator. The moment ends not with resolution, but with a clear sense that the conversation has shifted from light discussion to meaningful disagreement, the kind that unfolds slowly, live, and in full view of the audience. As the show returns from the break, the camera comes back up on the panel with a noticeably different energy than before. Everyone is still composed, still smiling in that practiced daytime television way, but the audience can sense that the conversation has weight now. Mark Wahlberg sits with his hands loosely clasped on the table, posture upright, listening as the moderator briefly reminds viewers what was being discussed before the pause. Joy Behar nods along, her expression neutral but attentive, signaling that she's ready to continue exactly where things left off. The moderator opens by acknowledging that conversations like this can be uncomfortable but are important, especially when they involve differing viewpoints expressed respectfully. That framing sets the tone for what follows, making it clear that the show intends to let the discussion breathe rather than shut it down. Joy Behar is given the floor first, and she takes a moment before speaking, choosing her words carefully. She reiterates her earlier point, this time with a bit more structure, explaining that while personal discipline is valuable, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. She mentions education, economic background, and access to opportunity, all delivered in a steady, conversational tone rather than an accusatory one. As she speaks, Wahlberg maintains eye contact, nodding occasionally to signal that he's listening. The audience remains quiet, with only a few soft sounds of agreement. When Joy finishes, she turns slightly toward him, leaving space for his response. Wahlberg begins calmly, thanking her for clarifying her perspective. He explains that he actually agrees with much of what she's saying, but that his concern is how easily discussions about personal responsibility are dismissed or criticized outright. His voice remains even, but there's a subtle emphasis on certain words that suggests he feels misunderstood. He goes on to describe how, in his experience, focusing on discipline helped him navigate difficult circumstances early in life. He's careful not to present it as a universal solution, explicitly stating that everyone's situation is different. This nuance slightly shifts the mood in the room. One of the co-hosts nods in agreement, adding a brief comment about the importance of acknowledging both individual effort and systemic challenges. The audience responds with a small round of applause, appreciating the attempt at balance. Joy Behar listens, arms resting on the table, and then responds by saying that she appreciates the clarification but still worries about how sound bites from interviews often travel further than full explanations. She points out that viewers don't always hear the nuance that Wahlberg is expressing now, especially when clips circulate online. Her tone remains measured, but there's a firmness in her delivery that keeps the disagreement alive. Wahlberg responds by challenging that idea gently but directly. He says that while he understands how media works, he can't control every interpretation of his words, and he doesn't believe that should stop him from speaking honestly about what worked for him. He emphasizes that he's not prescribing a one-size-fits-all approach, just sharing his own perspective. As he speaks, he gestures lightly with one hand, a restrained but visible sign of engagement. The moderator steps in briefly, summarizing the exchange for clarity and asking whether the issue is less about disagreement and more about emphasis. This reframing seems to slow the pace slightly, giving everyone a chance to reset. Joy Behar agrees that emphasis matters, and she explains that when public figures focus heavily on individual effort, it can unintentionally reinforce narratives that blame people for circumstances beyond their control. The audience reacts with a mix of murmurs and light applause. Wahlberg takes a breath before responding, clearly considering his words. He says that he believes motivation and accountability can coexist with compassion and awareness. He challenges the idea that encouraging people to take ownership of their choices necessarily leads to blame. His tone remains respectful, but there's a clear confidence in his stance. One of the co-hosts interjects with a personal anecdote, describing how messages about hard work were motivating for them, even while they acknowledged systemic barriers. This moment briefly diffuses the tension, and the audience responds positively. Joy Behar smiles slightly, acknowledging the point, but then adds that experiences can vary widely, which is why she believes caution is necessary. As the conversation continues, the pacing becomes more deliberate. There are longer pauses between responses, fewer interruptions. The hosts seem aware that the audience is following closely, and they allow each point to land before moving on. Wahlberg and Behar address each other directly now, rather than speaking through the moderator, which gives the exchange a more personal feel without becoming confrontational. Joy Behar asks a pointed but calm question about responsibility at a societal level, suggesting that focusing too much on individual stories can distract from collective solutions. Wahlberg responds by saying that he doesn't see those as competing ideas. He argues that societal change often begins with individuals feeling empowered rather than helpless. His voice remains steady, but there's a noticeable intensity in his focus. The studio audience reacts again, this time with scattered applause rather than a unified response. The mixed reaction underscores the divide in perspectives, both on the panel and among viewers. The moderator acknowledges the audience, reminding them that differing opinions are part of the conversation. As the segment approaches its latter half, the discussion becomes less about winning a point and more about clarifying positions. Joy Behar reiterates that her concern isn't with Wahlberg personally, but with broader messaging trends. Wahlberg responds by saying he respects her viewpoint and appreciates the chance to explain himself in a longer format than a typical interview allows. There's a noticeable softening in body language at this point. Wahlberg leans back slightly, and Joy Behar nods more frequently as he speaks. The tension hasn't disappeared, but it's become more controlled, more reflective. One of the co-hosts comments that this kind of exchange is rare on live television because it requires patience and mutual respect. As the moderator signals that time is running short for the segment, they ask each of them to offer a brief closing thought. Joy Behar says she hopes conversations like this encourage people to think critically about the messages they consume. Wahlberg says he hopes people feel encouraged rather than judged, regardless of their circumstances. The segment doesn't end with agreement, but it ends with acknowledgement. The audience applauds not loudly but steadily, recognizing the effort to engage thoughtfully. As the camera begins to pull back, the panel exchanges polite smiles, and the show transitions toward its next topic, leaving viewers with a conversation that feels unresolved but genuine, the kind that lingers beyond the studio walls. As the program moves forward, the atmosphere in the studio subtly shifts again. Even though the show transitions briefly to another topic, the earlier exchange clearly lingers in the room. When the moderator brings the conversation back to Mark Wahlberg, it's framed as a continuation rather than a restart, acknowledging that viewers are still engaged with what they just witnessed. Wahlberg is invited to reflect a bit more on how he approaches public conversations about values, and the way he responds suggests he understands the sensitivity of the moment. He begins by explaining that he's become more careful over the years about how he speaks in interviews, precisely because he knows how quickly statements can be reduced to headlines. His tone is reflective rather than defensive. He mentions that when he talks about discipline and structure, he's often speaking to people who feel stuck or discouraged, not to those who already have advantages. As he speaks, his hands rest calmly on the table, and his pacing is slower, giving his words more weight. Joy Behar listens closely, her posture relaxed but attentive. When Wahlberg finishes, she acknowledges that point, saying she appreciates the intent behind his messaging. However, she returns to the idea that intent doesn't always align with outcome, especially in a media environment driven by short clips and strong reactions. She notes that even well-meaning messages can reinforce simplified narratives if they're not framed carefully. The exchange remains calm, but there's a noticeable seriousness in both of their voices. One of the co-hosts glances toward the moderator, as if checking how much time remains, while another nods along, clearly invested in the discussion. The studio audience stays quiet, indicating close attention rather than passive viewing. Wahlberg responds by challenging the assumption that people are incapable of understanding nuance. He says that while media often simplifies things, he believes audiences are more thoughtful than they're sometimes given credit for. He argues that avoiding certain topics out of fear of misinterpretation can lead to even less honest conversations. His tone isn't confrontational, but it's firm, and his gaze remains steady as he addresses Joy directly. Joy Behar reacts by slightly raising her eyebrows and leaning forward, signaling engagement rather than opposition. She agrees that audiences are capable of nuance, but she counters that repetition matters. She explains that when certain messages are repeated frequently without equal emphasis on broader context, they can shape public perception in unintended ways. Her voice remains even, but her point is clearly defined. The moderator steps in briefly to keep the conversation flowing, noting that both sides seem to agree on the importance of balance, even if they differ on how it's achieved. This intervention helps reframe the discussion as a shared concern rather than a personal clash. The audience responds with a small wave of applause, appreciating the measured tone. At this point, another co-host introduces a related question about responsibility in the entertainment industry. She asks whether actors and public figures should feel obligated to adjust their messaging based on how it might be received by different audiences. Wahlberg considers this carefully before answering, taking a noticeable pause that feels longer on live television. When he responds, he says he believes in being thoughtful, but not in self-censorship. He explains that authenticity matters to him and that constantly adjusting his message to avoid criticism would feel dishonest. He adds that he's open to feedback and willing to clarify when misunderstandings arise, as he's doing now. His delivery is calm, but there's a clear sense of conviction. Joy Behar acknowledges that point and says she respects honesty, but she emphasizes that influence comes with responsibility. She gives an example of how certain narratives can shape policy debates and public attitudes, even when they're not intended to do so. The example is delivered without naming specifics, keeping the conversation general and appropriate for daytime television. The audience reacts with a low murmur, signaling engagement rather than agreement or disagreement. Wahlberg nods as she speaks, and when he replies, he focuses on common ground. He says he agrees that influence matters and that he tries to use his platform positively. He challenges the idea that focusing on discipline is inherently negative, reiterating that it can coexist with advocacy for systemic change. As the back and forth continues, the pacing remains steady. There are no interruptions, no raised voices, just a careful exchange of ideas. The hosts allow each other to finish speaking, which gives the segment a more serious tone than typical daytime discussions. The moderator occasionally interjects with clarifying questions, helping viewers follow the thread of the conversation. One of the co-hosts adds that the discussion reflects a broader cultural tension between personal responsibility and collective action. This comment broadens the scope of the segment, moving it beyond Wahlberg and Behar as individuals. The audience responds with a brief, thoughtful applause, recognizing the relevance of the topic. Joy Behar builds on that point, saying that she believes both ideas are necessary, but that media often frames them as opposites. She suggests that part of the challenge lies in how stories are told, not just in what's being said. Her tone softens slightly here, signaling a shift from critique to reflection. Wahlberg responds positively to this framing, saying that he appreciates the chance to talk about these issues in more depth than usual. He notes that long-form conversations allow for more understanding than quick sound bites. His body language relaxes further, and he offers a small smile, which the audience picks up on. The moderator signals that the segment is approaching another transition, thanking Wahlberg for engaging openly and Joy Behar for raising thoughtful concerns. The audience applauds again, this time more warmly, suggesting appreciation for the respectful tone of the exchange. As the camera pulls back slightly, the panel shifts in their seats, preparing to move on. Even as the show transitions, the discussion leaves a clear impression. It's not a moment defined by drama or spectacle, but by a sustained, thoughtful disagreement that unfolded slowly and openly. The kind of exchange that invites viewers to think rather than react. As the show continues, the conversation naturally evolves rather than ending abruptly. The moderator brings the focus back to Mark Wahlberg, tying the earlier discussion into a broader question about public dialogue and how disagreements are handled on live television. This framing acknowledges what viewers have just seen without amplifying it, keeping the tone consistent with a daytime talk show setting. Wahlberg responds with a slight nod, signaling his understanding of the shift. He speaks about the importance of having space for disagreement, especially in formats where conversations are often compressed. He notes that it's rare to be able to sit across from someone with a different perspective and talk it through calmly, and he expresses appreciation for that opportunity. His tone is measured and reflective, and his body language remains open, with his shoulders relaxed and his hands resting on the table. Joy Behar responds by agreeing that open conversation is valuable, but she adds that not all disagreements are treated equally in public discourse. She points out that some voices are amplified more than others, which can affect how conversations are perceived. Her delivery is calm, but there's a seriousness to her words that signals the topic still matters deeply to her. The audience listens quietly, and the studio feels more like a forum than an entertainment set at this moment. One of the co-hosts briefly comments that this kind of exchange is why the show exists, to bring differing perspectives together. The remark draws light applause, easing the atmosphere slightly. Wahlberg takes the comment as an opening to clarify his position further. He says that he never expects everyone to agree with him and that he's learned a lot from conversations where he's been challenged. He acknowledges that Joy's perspective represents concerns held by many people, and he says he respects that, even if he doesn't fully share it. His voice remains steady, and there's no sign of frustration, only emphasis. Joy Behar nods as he speaks, signaling that she hears the acknowledgement. When she responds, she explains that her role on the panel often involves pushing back, especially when she feels certain viewpoints might go unexamined. She emphasizes that disagreement doesn't have to be personal, and she makes a point of saying that she doesn't question Wahlberg's sincerity. This clarification subtly shifts the tone toward mutual respect. The moderator steps in to highlight that point, noting that the discussion has remained civil despite clear differences. This observation seems aimed at viewers as much as the panel, reinforcing the idea that disagreement can be constructive. The audience responds with a modest round of applause. As the segment progresses, another co-host introduces a question about how moments like this are perceived by viewers at home. She asks whether Wahlberg worries about being misunderstood when these clips circulate online without full context. Wahlberg answers honestly, saying that it's always a concern, but that he believes avoiding tough conversations isn't the solution. He explains that he'd rather clarify his views than stay silent. Joy Behar follows up by saying that she agrees conversations shouldn't be avoided, but she reiterates the importance of context and framing. She notes that shows like this have a responsibility to provide that context, especially when topics are complex. Her tone is thoughtful rather than confrontational. The audience reacts with a low murmur of agreement. The moderator acknowledges the point and briefly summarizes the discussion, helping viewers who may have joined late understand what's being debated. This recap reinforces that the exchange is about ideas, not personal conflict. Wahlberg then addresses the audience directly, speaking about how he hopes people watching take away a sense of encouragement rather than division. He emphasizes that his message is rooted in belief in people's ability to improve their circumstances, while recognizing that challenges exist. His delivery is calm and deliberate, and the audience responds with scattered applause. Joy Behar listens and then adds that encouragement is important, but so is empathy. She says that recognizing structural barriers doesn't mean discouraging individual effort, but rather understanding why paths differ. Her words land gently, and there's a sense that she's aiming for synthesis rather than opposition. One of the co-hosts comments that the conversation seems to be circling toward common ground, even if full agreement isn't possible. This observation lightens the mood slightly, and a few audience members laugh softly. Wahlberg smiles in response, and Joy Behar offers a small, acknowledging smile of her own. As the moderator signals that the segment is nearing its end, he thanks both Wahlberg and Behar for engaging thoughtfully. He notes that conversations like this reflect the reality of many discussions happening in households across the country. The audience applauds more fully now, appreciating the respectful exchange. The panel begins to transition toward the next segment, with hosts shuffling notes and adjusting their posture. Even as the focus shifts, the earlier discussion clearly lingers, having set a more serious tone for the show. It's the kind of moment that doesn't dominate headlines for its drama, but stands out for its realism. A public disagreement handled calmly, thoughtfully, and in real time. As the segment draws to a close, the moderator offers a final wrap-up, thanking Mark Wahlberg for joining the panel and acknowledging the depth of the conversation. The camera briefly pans across the table, capturing relaxed but thoughtful expressions from the hosts. Joy Behar adjusts her seat slightly and gives a polite nod in Wahlberg's direction, signaling that while the disagreement wasn't resolved, it was respectfully explored. Wahlberg responds with a brief smile, his posture noticeably more relaxed than at the start of the segment. The moderator transitions the show forward, noting that conversations like this often continue long after the cameras stop rolling. The studio audience applauds, not with the excitement reserved for celebrity announcements, but with steady appreciation. The applause feels like recognition rather than celebration, acknowledgement of a discussion that stayed grounded and appropriate for daytime television. As the show moves into the next segment, the atmosphere remains calm. There's no sense of lingering tension among the panelists. Joy Behar exchanges a few quiet words with one of the co-hosts while Wahlberg takes a sip of water, listening as the program shifts focus. To viewers at home, the disagreement appears complete, contained within the segment, and handled professionally. After the episode airs, the exchange quickly becomes a topic of discussion online. Short clips begin circulating on social media, particularly moments where Wahlberg challenges Joy Behar's framing of personal responsibility, and where Behar emphasizes the importance of context and systemic awareness. Viewers respond with a wide range of reactions. Some praise Wahlberg for remaining calm and clearly articulating his perspective. Others commend Behar for pressing on issues they feel are often overlooked in celebrity conversations. Comment sections reflect the same divide seen in the studio. Some viewers express appreciation for the respectful tone, noting that disagreements on television often become performative or overly dramatic. Others wish the conversation had gone further or included more concrete examples. A few commentators point out that the exchange felt refreshingly normal, a discussion between two people with different viewpoints, neither trying to dominate the other. In the hours following the broadcast, media coverage remains measured. Rather than framing the segment as a confrontation, most summaries describe it as a thoughtful debate. Headlines focus on the substance of the discussion rather than conflict, highlighting the contrast between individual responsibility and systemic factors. The tone of the coverage mirrors the tone of the segment itself, calm, analytical, and restrained. On subsequent episodes, the hosts briefly reference the conversation, clarifying that the goal was never to create tension, but to explore ideas openly. Joy Behar mentions that she appreciates guests who are willing to engage rather than deflect, reinforcing that disagreement is part of the show's format. The acknowledgement further softens any perception of conflict. Wahlberg, in later interviews, is asked about the exchange. He describes it as a healthy conversation and says he respects the panel for allowing space for nuance. He reiterates that he values discussions where people can disagree without animosity. His comments reinforce the impression left by the original segment. The studio audience reaction, both during and after the taping, remains consistent with what viewers saw on screen. Audience members later described the moment as serious, but not uncomfortable, noting that the calm pacing made it easier to follow the arguments being presented. There's no report of disruptions or heightened emotion once the cameras stop. In the days that follow, social media discussion gradually shifts away from the segment as new topics emerge. Still, the clip continues to be shared as an example of how talk shows can host meaningful disagreement without resorting to spectacle. Viewers reference it in broader conversations about media responsibility and public discourse. As the narrative around the moment settles, it becomes clear that what stood out wasn't a dramatic clash, but the absence of one. The exchange between Mark Wahlberg and Joy Behar is remembered as a realistic on-air disagreement, serious, thoughtful, and handled within the boundaries of daytime television. And as always, we want to hear from you. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.